Thank you very much, Ignacio. I hope that you can see my screen. And good afternoon, everybody. I hope this finds you well and that you found today's presentations interesting. We have the last slot, but hopefully you will find this last slot interesting as well. Some of you will be very familiar with what we're talking about. For some of you, this will be quite new. We are going to describe two of the new specifications in the xBRL family, where they fit in and what they mean for you. So let's run through our presentation, and we're going to try some slide sharing along the way. So what we're talking about today, two new specifications, xBRL-CSV and xBRL-JSON, are part of the open information model. The open information model is the strategic effort from the xBRL standard to modernize and simplify the way that we can interact with this information, both data and metadata. The OAM itself, together with these two new standards, reached recommendation status in October. So even though many of you will have heard us speaking about these new specs for a number of years, they have now reached recommendation level. They are now stable. The only changes that will be made to these specs are errata. There are no substantive changes to the specs themselves expected. So the key thing associated with this modernization effort is to decouple the xBRL standard away from its XML roots. Many of you are very familiar with the way that xBRL connects and has used XML since its inception, and ever since xBRL 2.1 was published in way back in 2003, and then layers of additional capability have been added with new modular specifications, but all utilizing key features of XML. And at the turn of the century, XML was an extremely important technology to be utilizing, and a set of standards provided by the W3C. These days, XML is less popular. It's no longer taught in most universities, but nevertheless, while it also provides a host of capabilities which have taken a little while to replace. The idea of decoupling xBRL from XML means that the way that you should think about the xBRL standard should change. Don't think of xBRL as a technology or as a syntax. Think of xBRL as a standard. It is the semantics or meaning required to represent any kind of report in a digital format, in addition to that abstract view of what a digital report, how it should be defined and how it is used. It also provides a range of optional syntax that you can use, and you should match the right syntax to your circumstances. The OAM also does a few other things. It removes a few seldom used features. Either features that were seldom used or where they were used created confusion or complexity in implementation. So you'll find that the OAM simplifies a range of features of the original 2.1 framework. And it also unifies dimensions as well as some other add-on specifications. This is a sort of a refactoring exercise that had never occurred in the past. The OAM gives us that opportunity. However, that's, if you like, the top layer of all of this. That's the theoretical aspect. What does that mean for you? What does it mean for regulators? What does it mean for vendors? What does it mean for users? What does it mean for issuers? So we have two specifications, as we've mentioned, both xBRL-JSON and xBRL-CSV. And these are two new standardized formats for use with xBRL. The first is xBRL-JSON, and this makes xBRL data extremely easy to consume. If you've not already seen some of our presentations and demonstrations in this field, you'll see more of them in the future, but there are also a number available on the xbrl.org website. You can take an xBRL file, convert it in a lossless manner into xBRL-JSON, and then consume it into many off-the-shelf tools, including simple things like Office 365, without having to go through some of the rigmarole that you've needed to do to be able to take xBRL data and analyze it. So this gives you some new options in that space. xBRL-CSV is designed to take advantage of an even older standard, comma-separated values, CSV, an oldie but a goodie, highly used everywhere, and in the context of xBRL is very key for large volume or granular data. Paul's going to talk a little bit more about the way that that works and how that fits in just a minute. I want to leave you with a couple of other thoughts. First is that here's some new syntax, so you can think about xBRL as in I guess 4 primary ways. You can think about it in inline xBRL, which many of you are very familiar with as you work in terms of corporate reporting. You can think about it in terms of XML, which is traditional like xBRL 2.1, also represented as xBRL XML. You can now utilize xBRL-JSON and xBRL-CSV, but you have options in the future. We can move to expand the level, the number of syntax and number of formats that are supported. So they're just different representations of the same information. And as I've already said, an xBRL processor that supports these formats, and there are increasing numbers of them, can transform data from one to the other in a lossless manner. So this is my handoff point to go to Paul, but I would like you to have a think about, as you listen to and see these new ideas, I'd like you to think about what this could mean for you in your environment. It could mean, for example, a capacity to capture more granular information in ways that haven't been possible or practical in the past. It might be possible to utilize these tools to create your own analytics with xBRL Smarts baked in, and you should be able to do more and more of that as you move forward. People are starting to experiment with xBRL-CSV just to be able to create simple forms which have the advantages of being backed by xBRL metadata. They can be validated. They can also be displayed in various formats. So we're looking forward to innovations in that field, just replacing traditional forms, but having a much better and consistent metadata backing. xBRL-JSON, of course, is highly web friendly. So you can think about that in terms of the way that you publish information if you're a regulator or other consumer of large quantities of information. And the other area that is likely to be of interest to many of you is the idea that these new formats likely lend themselves to utilizing a wide range of machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities to apply against the increasingly large volumes of xBRL data that exist around the world. So those are just a few thoughts for you to consider as we move forward. But I'm now going to pass over to Paul Warren, our technical director, who's going to dive into some of the details about xBRL-CSV and xBRL-JSON. So Paul, is that working? Can you control my screen? Yes.
Yes, sorry. Okay, yeah, that seems to be working. Thank you, John. So what I'd like to do is just go into a little bit more detail about these 2 new standards that we've got, these 2 new formats, and then talk briefly about the next steps now that they have been finalized. So looking first at xBRL-JSON, I think the first question is why do we need xBRL-JSON? And to answer that question, simply go to Stack Overflow, which is a popular website where developers can ask each other questions, and have a look at some of the questions that come up relating to xBRL. And what you'll find is a lot of developers being very confused, both by xBRL and indeed by XML. As John mentioned, at the time we were developing xBRL 2.1, XML was an emerging and popular technology. Times have moved on, and now XML skills are something of a rarity amongst developers. People now are much more frequently looking at JSON. But beyond the syntax, the way that xBRL uses XML is confusing. The split between the contexts and the facts made sense originally, but now that we have dimensional data, that actually just adds complexity to consuming xBRL. And it's not working very reliably, that. John, can you just move on to the next slide, please? So xBRL-JSON is intended to be, as I mentioned, a developer-friendly xBRL format, and the primary use case that we see for JSON is for publishing XBRL data to make it more accessible. So where you've got regulators collecting reports and then publishing that data on, publishing them in JSON format makes it more accessible to users. And as Ignacio mentioned in his presentation earlier, we've set up at xBRL International, we've set up filings.xbrl.org, which is a repository of as many of the initial ESEF filings as we could find. And we've tried to make it as accessible in a number of different ways. I should add that we intend filing.xbrl.org to be a short-term solution to making XBRL filings more accessible within ESEF. There is a longer-term plan to develop a formal EU-wide ESEF repository referred to as ESAP. And one of the things we want to do with filings.xbrl.org is provide inspiration to that project to show how you can make XBRL data more accessible. So yeah, if we look at, the control is working. So looking at an individual filing, we make the filings available using our interactive iXBRL viewer, which allows people to explore filings and search for facts and get some basic comparative data out of them. And this is a good way to review the filing interactively. But for each filing, we've also made it available as xBRL-JSON. And if you go to the filing.xbrl.org index page, you'll see a link to the JSON for any filing. And if you have a look, excuse me, if you have a look on any individual fact, if you click through to the JSON for a particular report, you'll see a lot of facts that look like this. Now, I normally try to avoid showing any syntactic details in presentations because that's not how we should be looking at xBRL. We should be looking at xBRL through tools that make the data more accessible. But anyone who's ever looked at the XML version of an xBRL report will immediately recognize that what we're looking at here is an awful lot simpler than having to resolve context, resolve units, understand dimensions. It all puts all the fact information in a single place. But as I say, business users don't want to look at JSON either, but making XBRL easier for developers is good for end users too. By lowering the barrier to entry, we make XBRL data accessible to more developers. And also for developers, less time spent dealing with the XML format means more time can be spent making their products do useful things like analytics. And speaking of which, xBRL-JSON has benefits not just for developers. xBRL-JSON is sufficiently simple that it can be loaded directly into many off-the-shelf analysis tools. My colleague Revathi has done a good amount of investigation, taking SEC examples, converting them to xBRL-JSON using standard XBRL processors, and loading them into Tableau. And what you see on the screen here is just a simple example of what's possible by loading xBRL-JSON data directly into Tableau and producing analytics and metrics from that. So that's not starting from the xBRL-JSON. No XBRL-specific software is needed to create these kind of metrics. So that's xBRL-JSON. As I say, we think it has a very important role to play in making xBRL-JSON, to making XBRL data more accessible. So let's now have a look at xBRL-CSV. And xBRL-CSV was originally a proof of concept for the OIM model. When we started out on the OIM initiative a number of years ago, we agreed that we should have 2 example concrete formats that other than XML as a proof that the model worked. And the first of those was easy. We chose JSON for that. And then we thought, well, we better have another one. We thought, well, let's use CSV. But at the time, we thought this was really just a proof of concept thing. But actually, as we went on, we realized that it has significant potential as a useful format in its own right, because it is universally supported. Just about every data-centric tool has a CSV import or export function, but also because it's extremely compact. So where you're dealing with large file sizes, CSV data has some significant advantages. So what xBRL-CSV does is it combines the simplicity and compactness of the CSV file format with the metadata that you get from XBRL, in particular from XBRL taxonomies. And xBRL-CSV is very good for tabular data. It's very, very good for granular data, where you have very, very large quantities of data and need a very efficient and compact representation. So the important thing to understand about xBRL-CSV is that it's not a one-size-fits-all solution for every shape of XBRL report. To use xBRL-CSV, you need to create what we refer to as the xBRL-CSV metadata, and that effectively customizes the shape of your CSV tables and documents how you map those CSV tables into XBRL data. And the reason we do that is because if we try to come up with a generic format for XBRL in CSV, we'd end up with fairly complex tables, probably fairly sparsely populated tables. Whereas by using this mapping that allows you to define a custom structure for the CSV table, we can arrange the tables in a way that makes sense for the data. So if you've got, for example, information about a large number of loans that's held by a bank, you can put each information for each loan on a row in the table and have just the data that relates to that loan on each row, leading to a very compact representation. Here's an example of exactly that. Here we have an xBRL-CSV example defining 35 facts in seven rows. As you can see, this is a pretty compact representation, and the column headers at the top are used to automatically map this back into XBRL data via the xBRL-CSV metadata. So just for comparison, and again, as I say, I don't like showing syntax on screen. Here's the XBRL XML version of the same 35 facts. As you can see, I did have to reduce the font size a little bit to get it onto the screen. Now you may think, well, this is a slightly unfair comparison because I haven't shown you the JSON metadata that's required to do the mapping from the CSV format. That is a fair criticism, but the important thing is, firstly, that JSON isn't actually very big, but secondly, it's static. So the more facts I add to the CSV version, it's just another row in the CSV. There's no, it's the JSON metadata is just a static overhead, so it doesn't grow with the file size. Whereas in the XBRL XML version, the file size increases significantly with each fact. So just to outline a typical reporting scenario with xBRL-CSV, how you'd actually use it in the real world. A regulator that wants to collect xBRL-CSV reports would publish an XBRL taxonomy, just as you would if you were collecting XML reports. And that defines the data types, labels, which of course can be multi-language, definitions, references, all the usual stuff that we're used to with XBRL. You can define formula validation rules. And then alongside that taxonomy, you publish xBRL-CSV metadata. And I say alongside, in fact, you can put it as part of the same taxonomy package. So the regulators just publishing a single package, and that defines the mapping from the CSV tables, things that look like the structure I showed 2 slides ago, and it defines how that maps into XBRL concepts and dimensions. And having published that, an XBRL filer in this reporting scenario needs to provide CSV files. An XBRL CSV report can consist of more than one CSV file, and where there are multiple files, those get packaged up into a zip file, along with a truly trivial and in fact static JSON file which just references the metadata that's used to convert it. So what the filer is required to provide is very, very simple. So one question which does come up is why would I use xBRL-CSV rather than just ordinary CSV? Well, the reason is because xBRL-CSV is backed by the metadata that you get from XBRL taxonomies. CSV off the shelf doesn't have any data typing, it doesn't have any dimensional models, it doesn't have any way of doing validation. All of these things are things you can get from XBRL taxonomies. And references to authoritative definitions. We've got unit registries, we've got unit type validation, so we can check that the units that you're using for a particular fact make sense, including currency checks. We've got native data types for legal entity identifiers. All the data quality framework that XBRL has built up is available to you if you're using xBRL-CSV. And as we've outlined in this presentation, you can easily convert that format into other formats. So it's easy to take that CSV, having collected it in CSV format, and transform it into JSON to make it easier to consume elsewhere. So the real advantage of xBRL-CSV in a nutshell is the data collector who wants to start collecting data just needs to publish their reporting requirements in the form of an XBRL taxonomy with its accompanying metadata, publish that in an open standard format, and they pretty much ready to start collecting from filers who again prepare their reports using the same open standard. This contrasts with trying to produce your own reporting environment, which typically involves defining the structure of CSV files and then trying to document what you're supposed to put in them in a Word document or some other human readable format, which makes it much harder to implement and validate the data. So as John's mentioned, these standards are now all at recommendation status, which is the final stage of our standardization process. It indicates that the specification is final, stable. It's not going to be changed except to correct any errata issues that come up. We've only got to this stage because we've got 2 independent implementations of the specification that are passing the test suites that we have. So the recommendation status gives you a significant guarantee of the maturity of the specification. So what happens next? These specifications are now in maintenance mode. We will very shortly be announcing our plans for software certification of software that implements these standards. As John mentioned, we've already got a number of packages that do implement the standards, and we will shortly be adding formal certification of their compliance to our existing certification program. The OIM working group is looking at now at creating a taxonomy model. We've got the OIM report model, and the taxonomy model is the next step for that working group. But also the formula working group is looking at how formula rules can be applied natively to xBRL-CSV and xBRL-JSON. So I'll just very quickly touch on that. xBRL-CSV is based on OIM, as is xBRL-JSON, which means that a conformant processor convert those files into XBRL-XML format, which means you can validate them just as before. So you can already apply formula validation rules to CSV reports and to JSON reports. That's available today. But of course, the reason we want to use xBRL-CSV is often because of its more efficient representation, is smaller file sizes. And if you have to convert to XML, then you lose that advantage. So formula validation is available today, but using it via the XML channel largely negates the performance benefits that you expect to get from using it. So the formula working group is now looking at coming up with what is currently referred to as OIM safe formula. which is an initiative to allow XBRL formula rules to be evaluated directly on an xBRL-CSV report, an xBRL-JSON report, or any other OIM format. XBRL formula is actually fairly well suited to doing this, but as it stands, it has the ability to, you can write rules that access the XML document directly. So the OIM safe version of XBRL formula, it simply forbids operations that require an XML document to be present, so they can be evaluated directly on xBRL-JSON, xBRL-CSV. It's worth noting that most well-written formula rules are already OIM compatible. They don't require access to the XML document in order to be evaluated. Migrating existing formulas to the new format should actually require very little effort. That's what the XBRL formula working group is now focused on. If you have an interest in that, please do get involved. So finally, I just want to summarize where the finalization of the open information model specification leaves us. Effectively, this gives us a range of different tools that we can use for different reporting scenarios. We have iXBRL or inline XBRL, which, as you know, is in use for ESEF, and we don't see OIM having any immediate impact on that because inline XBRL is particularly well suited to the problem of open corporate reporting, where you have tag data tied into a human readable presentation. We do think that xBRL-JSON has a role in making the data available, making the data in those reports more accessible, but we see inline XBRL continuing to be used for the reporting channel there because the tied presentation is so important. But we've got these new tools. We've got xBRL-CSV, which is very well suited for high volume granular reporting, or indeed any form of tabular reporting. And we've got xBRL-JSON, which can be used for reporting, but we see its immediate use in the world of analytics and making XBRL data more usable. And we also have XBRL 2.1, which remains fully supported and maintained. The existing specifications aren't going anywhere, and the base specification working group continues to maintain those. So we have these 4 different report formats. All of them are backed by exactly the same rich metadata and validation that you get from XBRL taxonomies. So OIM is here, and it really does expand the tools that the XBRL standard offers you. So with that, I'd like to open up the floor, ask if we have any questions.